Are you in denial? Because Saxon sure is. Let's talk about White Lotus Season 3, Episode 6. The sixth episode in the season is titled Denial, and, well, there's a lot of it in this episode, so let's dive right in. The first thing we see this episode is Timothy actually shoots himself. Victoria and Piper run in horrified, and we see the scene play out with him actually pulling the trigger, but, of course, it's just a dream. There are a couple of dream scenarios in this where he shoots himself, and then another one where he shoots Victoria and then himself. We also see in the look ahead next week that there's a scene where Timothy has blood all over his shirt. Okay, haha, another dream sequence, Mike White. Unless this one's real? Maybe? Meanwhile, the Ratliff boys wake up after their drug and alcohol-filled night trying to put the pieces together of what happened. Saxon is totally out of it with no recollection of what happened. All he can slightly remember is Jaclyn and Chloe hooking up in the bed next to him while, well, he did things to himself. However, he starts to slowly come to the realization that, well, the Targaryen vibes went even deeper than we thought, and I'll leave it at that. Jaclyn, despite being younger and not being quite as used to the partying, doesn't really seem to be as out of it the next morning, but he says he can't remember anything, and Saxon says, hey man, we just both blacked out, let's leave it at that. They go back to the resort where Victoria tells Saxon and Jaclyn what Piper's plans are, and of course, we know that Jaclyn already knows, so because of that, Jaclyn finally comes to her aid and backs her up. The whole family, minus Saxon, goes to the monastery to meet with the monk for Piper. Piper talks with him about her family's issues and then says, hey, I'm going to go get my parents to talk to you. However, Victoria's wandering the compound off somewhere, but Timothy goes in and asks him a question about the afterlife and dying, and the monk actually makes it sound very comforting. I can't tell if it's going to be comforting in the way that's maybe foreshadowing to him actually turning the gun on himself, or comforting in the way that, you know what, everything's going to be all right, and I think that's probably it, and maybe he won't use the gun after all. Who knows? I was on the Timothy is totally going to die bandwagon for most of this show, but I jumped off last week, and I'm still saying that he probably lives, but we'll see. Victoria is not supportive of Piper whatsoever, so she says she'll only support the decision if she can spend one night there that night. Piper asks Jaclyn to stay behind, and he does, which I'm kind of surprised that Victoria let Jaclyn stay. While meditating with Piper and a bunch of other people, though, Jaclyn all of a sudden remembers his Targaryen encounter with his brother. We see in the look ahead, he says, I don't want to fall prey to my dark side, and so we'll see if that actually does come to play a little more. Back at the resort, Saxon goes to the pool and tries to sober up and clear his head. He sits next to Chelsea, who is then joined by Chloe, and they tell him that, hey, you did indeed do stuff with your brother. He can't figure out why Chelsea wouldn't hook up with him, and she says, well, that's because I found my soulmate, and you're soulless. Speaking of Chloe, Greg knows that she hooked up with at least one of the brothers. Chloe admits to Chelsea that she actually hooked up with both of them. Greg doesn't let it go when he talks to Chloe that morning, but ultimately decides, hey, let's have a party and invite the Ratliffs, along with others, including Belinda. We finally had another confrontation between Greg and Belinda where Belinda looks scared for her life. Greg says, hey, we need to talk, and invites her to his house, but she declines. Speaking of Belinda, her son Zion has finally shown up at the resort, and the first thing he sees is, well, his mom's in bed with a guy named Pornchai, which I still think is a great name. Pornchai clearly has a thing for Belinda, and he even suggests at work the next day that the two of them should start a wellness center together like Belinda and Tanya were going to do before Greg stole Tanya away. Meanwhile, in the girl's story, we see that Kate knows about Valentin coming to see Jaclyn the night before. She tells Laurie, who's hurt, but decides to play it off like it's really no big deal. However, she does confront Jaclyn about it and admits that Kate was the one that snitched on her, and so they kind of start to fight over it, really fracturing their friendship even more. Things have been leading up to the Muay Thai fight in episode 7, but while Laurie still wants to go with her, whatever, I don't care attitude about it all, the others don't seem as keen to go. Speaking of the fight, Gaitok is supposed to go too, but first, he has gun practice. However, he has to get the gun before he can do that. So he waits for Saxon to leave the room, then goes in, finds the gun, and takes it back. He crosses paths with Timothy as they're returning from the monastery as Gaitok leaves the room, but Timothy doesn't even acknowledge him. Timothy still doesn't realize the gun is gone, and I feel like we'll get a lot more from Gaitok's story in the next episode. Finally, Rick is still in Bangkok and talks to Chelsea finally on the phone. He says he just needs one more night, and we see his plan is not only to meet with Sri Tala, but to try and go to her home so that he can confront her husband, Jim. Frank, played by Sam Rockwell, is back to pose as a director for the film that he's been talking about, and he says Frank wants to see her in her natural habitat, so they go to the house at the end, and we hear Jim introduce himself to Frank off screen as Rick prepares to go in. The look ahead for episode 7 has some interesting parts to it. It starts with that head monk that we saw in this episode from the monastery talking about how we all have the capacity to kill and we have violence and aggression within us. Since this episode centers around the fight and a house party where Greg has reasons to be mad at a lot of people and Rick literally wanted to kill somebody, it could get very tense. I mentioned there's a scene with Timothy with blood all over his shirt, but we know those are dreams, at least for now. There are multiple clips of Laurie wandering town and also a verbal altercation with Jaclyn at dinner. There are scenes of Saxon acting confused, whether it's about his sexuality, his career, which is likely to go away with all of Timothy's issues, or any of the other confusing aspects of his life in this trip. And we also see Zion tell Belinda, hey, go talk to Greg and see what he has to say. Maybe she's more willing to confront him head on if Zion is by her side. We also see Rick pointing a gun at who we're meant to assume is Jim, but we'll see. I'm still kind of thinking that Jim may actually be Rick's dad instead of the one who killed him. I can still see the angle of he had a son, he doesn't want to be there, he leaves, and they play the story up like he was killed, but in reality, he just left Rick and his mom behind. So with only 2 episodes left, there's still a lot to learn about the characters, and we're now getting close to the shootout that we saw at the beginning. We know Zion isn't involved in the initial altercation because we see it play out through his eyes first, but who will get caught up in it, and then who's ultimately going to be responsible for it all? Leave your predictions in the comments, and I'll give my final predictions after next week's episode. It should be a really good one. The penultimate episodes usually are some of the best in TV. Also, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more White Lotus recaps, other TV recaps like Severance that just ended, movie reviews, and so much more.